For this lesson, we'll be looking a little bit more at factoring. So far, we've done factoring where we don't have an a value. If the a value is not there, right, the a value is the value in front of the x squared. If it's not there, we assume it's like a 1x squared. And we just leave it out. Now, when we were factoring with that, we were just looking for numbers that multiplied to c, the last number, and added to b, the middle number. And that gave us the two brackets if we could figure out those numbers. The problem is that as soon as you get an a value, as soon as you get some value out front, it makes it a little bit harder. For example, if I have a 2x squared, that one's not too bad. I know one of the brackets has to be 2x plus something, and the other bracket has to be x plus something, right? Because that way my first terms will give me a 2x squared. But what if my first number is 12x squared? Well, now we end up with a lot of different possibilities, because if I wanted my first terms to multiply to give 12x squared, it could be 12x times x. It could be 3x times 4x. It could be 6x times 2x. And that's only the first term of my brackets. I also have options for the second terms. So it's a lot harder factoring when there is an a value up front. So we're going to follow through some steps here. And then once we kind of get used to the pattern that we're following to solve these ones, then we'll talk a little bit more about why it works. All right, so what are the steps? First thing you're going to do is you're going to multiply the a and c values. So multiply the first and last numbers. Okay, so in this case, multiplying my first and last numbers. So a times c, first and last, 2 times 3 is 6. Okay, so that actually tells me what numbers I'm looking for that multiply. So we don't use the last number like we did earlier. We use the a times c. So we use the first times last number. So I'm going to choose a bunch of multiples that multiply to 6, a bunch of factors that multiply to 6. Okay, so numbers that multiply to 6, 1 and 6, 2 and 3, right? I'll list out as many as I need to, and we're going to choose the ones that add to the middle number, just like before. We're going to choose the ones that add to 7. Okay, and I've circled it. Okay, so those are the ones we're going to use. The only problem is that when you have an a value, you're not done. So next step. Right, we can't just use x plus 1 and x plus 6 because then where does our 2 come from out front? Okay, so now what we do is we start by filling the inside of the chart. All right, well, what do I know in the inside? I know that I have to get a 2x squared. That's my first number there. And I know that my last number has to be a 3. And I now also know that the two other numbers are going to match up with the factors that I choose. So a plus 1x and a plus 6x. And it doesn't matter which box you put in. You can put them in either order. So I just did plus 1x and plus 6x. So we filled in the inside of the chart. But we want factored form. So what we're really interested in is what are those two brackets right on the outside. All right, so now our last step is we are going to find common factors to fill the outside of the chart. So you're now going to look through each row and each column, and you're going to see if there's a common factor, if there's something that you could divide both terms nicely by. Okay, so looking through this first row, is there a common factor that I can pull out of both those terms? It looks like an x. An x shows up in both of them. And I don't think there's any numbers, right? A 1, but okay, so I can pull out an x from both those terms. Let's look at the next row. Is there something that I can factor out nicely here? It looks like they both divide nicely by 3, so I can factor out a 3. Okay, so that's one of my brackets. Now we look at the columns. Okay, first column, is there anything I can factor out nicely here? It looks like I can factor out an x, right? They both have an x in them. And I can factor out a 2, so I can factor out a 2x. Right? When I'm looking for terms that factor, it's what can I divide nicely by, right, without creating any fractions. And the last one, is there anything I can factor out here? There's no x here, so not an x. A 1, that's the only thing I can divide nicely by, so plus 1. And we're done. That's our factored form, the two brackets. 2x plus 1 times x plus 3. Now you could always double check your answer, right? If you go back to the chart, 2x plus 1, x plus 3, right? If you fill that in, right? If you multiply each row and each column, 2x squared, 1x, 6x, 3, and then you added your like terms, 2x squared plus 7x plus 3. Yep, it brings you back to that standard form. So we have not changed the equation. All we've done is rewrite it so that it involves two brackets multiplying. And because there was an a value, there was some sort of coefficient out front, there's going to be at least one coefficient inside of the brackets here. All right, so at this point, I'll get you guys to try the next one out. So I would pause the video, see if you can go through all of those steps again, and we'll take it up in a second here. All right, here we go. So first step, multiply your a and c values. 3 times 6, so 3 times 6 is 18. That tells you what you're going to be multiplying by, what numbers you're going to be multiplying to. Okay. So you're going to write down all the possibilities of numbers that multiply to 18. 1 times 18, 2 times 9, 3 times 6. You could even have negatives in there, but I don't think we'll need them. Right, -3 times -6. Write down as many as you can think of, and we're going to choose the ones that add to the middle number. Add to 11. All right, so I think it was 9 and 2. So 9 and 2 multiply to 18 and add to 11. So this step is exactly the same as last week. The only difference is that you're not looking for numbers that multiply to the last number. You're looking for numbers that multiply to 3 times 6, so 18. All right, we've done the first two steps. Fill the inside of the chart. Okay, we know that there has to be a 3x squared. And we know there has to be a 6. And we now know that our two factors that we chose were a plus 2x and a plus 9x. And once again, it doesn't matter where you put them. I'll just put them in one of those two boxes. And then we just go through each row and each column and we find the common factors to fill the outside of the chart. All right, first row. Is there a common factor there? Looks like I can factor out an x. That's it. Next row, is there a common factor? I think they both divide nicely by 3, plus 3. All right, first column, is there a factor here? I think I can pull out a 3 and an x. Right, there's a common factor of a 3 and an x. And last column, common factor here. I think I can factor out a 2. Okay, so there's our two brackets. 3x plus 2 times x plus 3. That's our factored form. So these steps are a little bit weird, but really all we're doing, or what these steps are doing, is they're getting you to fill in the chart backwards. Right? I mean, you know there has to be a 3x squared here, and you know that there has to be a 6 here. Right? The first and the last numbers have to show up there in the chart. And then you're using the multiplying and the adding in order to figure out how are you going to break this up, right? Are you going to write it as plus 3x plus 6x? Are you going to write it as plus 2x plus 9x, right? So it's making you choose the right numbers here that match up with that middle term. And then you're just looking at common factoring in order to figure out what the two brackets are, right? So that each row and each column multiplies to give the correct thing. So all these steps are doing is they're just getting you to fill in this chart backwards. And that's really all factoring is, right? It's switching a standard form into a factored form, right? It's opposite of foiling, of expanding the brackets. So these ones are, this is as tricky as the factoring gets, right? So do your best on the practice questions today, and we'll get some more practice with it later on. But this is kind of the hardest type of factoring questions. If you do have any questions, let me know this week, because these are a little bit tricky ones. All right, we'll go through and do sums with negatives now. The steps are exactly the same still. All right, first step, multiply your A and C number, first and last number. All right, 4 times -5 is -20. That tells me I'm looking for numbers that multiply to -20. Okay, and I'll just start making a big list, right? 1 times, or -20 times 1, -10 times 2, -5 times 4. Make a big list, all of the numbers I can think of that are all the pairs that multiply to -20, and we're going to choose the pair that adds to the middle number that adds to -8. So -10 and 2, that seems like it works. -10 and 2 multiplies to -20 and adds to -8. Okay, then we start to fill the chart from the inside. Okay, we need a 4x squared. We need a -5. And we know that the 2x terms will now be a -10x and a +2x. And those go in these two boxes here, either spot. Now we look for common factors in each row and each column. All right, so factoring out here, is there a like term from my first row? Yes, I can pull out an x, and I think I can also divide nicely by 2. Right, so 2x. All right, is there a common factor here? The only number that I can divide both of them nicely by is a 1, so just +1. Okay, first column, is there anything I can factor out from both of these? A common factor here. It looks like I can pull out a 2 from both of them to divide nicely by 2, and also x. So 2x. And the last one, is there some sort of common factor I can do here? Now, what you'll notice here is anytime you have a negative as the first number that you're looking at, when you're looking at a row or column, you have to pull out a negative. So in this case, I can factor out a, looks like a 5, -5. Okay, so that is my factored form. 2x - 5 and 2x + 1. 2x - 5 times 2x + 1. Now in this case, let's double check if this works here. 2x times 2x is 4x squared, right? That's where our 4x squared comes from. We have our middle terms and our -5 at the end. So when there's negatives, it's still the exact same steps. The only trick is whenever you're pulling out a like term or a common term, if there's a negative as the first thing that you see in that row or the column, then you have to pull out a negative. You can also double check that it works if you go backwards, right? -5 times 1, -5. -5 times 2x, -10x. 2x times 1, 2x, right? So it still works out. All right, so at this point, I'll get you to pause the video and see if you can try the next one out. It's a little bit messy, but we'll take it up here in a minute. All right, hopefully you had a chance to try the last one out. Let's see what you got here. Multiply A and C. 12 times 12 is 144. I'm looking for numbers that multiply to 144. All right, it's going to be a whole bunch of options, right? Think of as many as I need to, right? I actually know, I know that I'm looking for ones that add to negative 25. So I decided to use two negatives because I knew right off the bat I would need two negatives to multiply to a positive and add to a negative. So numbers that multiply to 144, negative 12, negative 24 times 6, negative 16 times 9. Right, I just went through and made a big list. What are all the pairs of numbers that multiply to 144? And I'm going to choose the ones that add to negative 25. So negative 16 and negative 9. Now we fill our chart in from the inside out. So 12x squared plus 12. My two middle terms will be negative 16x and negative 9x. And then we go through each row and each column and look for common terms. First row, is there a common factor here? We want the biggest common factor. So, okay, I can pull out an x and I can pull out a 4, I think is the biggest one, right? I can divide these both nicely by 4. You can divide them nicely by 2 as well, right? But you want the biggest common factors. I think the biggest common factor here is a 4x. Okay, next row. What am I going to factor out here? Well, there is a negative as the first number in that row. So it will be a negative, and I think they both divide nicely by 3. So negative 3. First column. It looks like these both divide nicely by 3 and also the x, 3x. In this case, positive was the first thing that I saw, so it is the positive I'm factoring out. And last column, negative is the first thing I see, so it will be negative. And I think the biggest number that they both divide nicely by is a 4, so negative 4. Okay, so those are my two brackets. 3x minus 4 times 4x minus 3. All right, so there's a couple practice questions for you guys to try out. Just do your best on them. These are the trickiest factoring ones that I mentioned earlier. So you can use the answers to help you check as you go, and also email me if you have any questions.